right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today at the Hoover Institution. This is the Johnson Center, the Hoover Institution's outpost in Washington, D.C. One of the ongoing discussion series we have here in this office, some of you know, is called Opening Arguments, Conversations on American Constitutionalism. And the idea of the series is that we should talk about the Constitution and self-governance, not just in the context of the courts and the Supreme Court, of course that's important, but also in terms of our everyday living, how we govern ourselves as a people. And on that subject, there's literally nobody better to speak than our guest today, as you know, Judge J. Harvie Wilkinson. It's such a pleasure to have you here today. Just a brief introduction. Judge Wilkinson is a graduate of Yale University and then the University of Virginia School of Law. He was a law professor at Virginia and then editorial page editor at the Norfolk Virginian Pilot before joining the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division in 1982. 2 years later, President Reagan appointed him to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, where you continue to serve today. And you were chief judge of that court 1998 to 2003. I
can't remember the years.
Both before and during his service on the bench, Judge Wilkinson authored a number of insightful books, including the two books we're discussing today. The first, published in 2012, is called Cosmic Constitutional Theory, Why Americans Are Losing Their Inalienable Right to Self-Governance. It's this one here. And the second, published last year, is All Falling Faiths, Reflections on the Promise and Failure of the 1960s. Now, while on their face these two books seem to cover two different subjects, I think they actually share much in common, and they arise from the same basic insights and instincts of our author. I loved reading both these books, and so it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today, Judge. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm particularly honored to be at the Hoover Institution, and because I think it sets such a standard of excellence in public policy thought. And I'm happy to be with you, Adam, because I've been not only a friend but an admirer of yours for a good many years, and appreciate the contributions that you make to the legal dialogue, and you struggle with some of the toughest issues.
That's very kind of you, Judge. Let's stop it right there. I think I'm going to quit while we're ahead. Actually, let's start with the first lines of the book, All Falling Faiths. It's such a stirring line. You say, "They call us baby boomers. We've been misnamed. We are the 60s generation who, now with unaccustomed humility, must beseech future generations to build back the nation we did much to tear down." That's remarkable. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think the 60s did some good in making us a more inclusive nation, and it should receive credit for that. But my problem with that it did so at such an enormous cost, and in the course of doing that, it inflicted enormous damage across many areas of society, and it's the damage is something that we're suffering still, and we're trying to recover from. And so what I try to do is approach the 1960s in a very personal way through a memoir, because it seemed to me that the debate on the 1960s was people were shouting at each other. They were doing, there were screeds and this and that, and everyone was storming the barricades. And nobody was persuading anybody. And so what I wanted to do was approach the 1960s not in an abstract way, but in a very, very personal way, with a memoir, and say, okay, I think this is what it was like. And I felt, well, maybe if I can speak sotto voce in a memoir and very personally and very honestly, that I might have a better chance of persuading people that notwithstanding the good it accomplished, the 60s did this nation incalculable harm. And the basic approach to this was to take one chapter and each chapter show how a different American value was transgressed and damaged in a way that we're still trying to repair. So I began with education and indicated how education gradually shifted from becoming a process of disinterested inquiry, and it became an agenda-driven exercise, and it became highly politicized. And I think that was a great damage to education, on which, frankly, the future of our country depends on a healthy educational system, and one that people can trust to be somewhat, at least, disinterested and not agenda-driven. And the second chapter, I deal again in a personal way with the damage done to the family unit and to our sense of commitment to one another in male-female relationships, and talk about the sexual revolution in the 1960s and why that too had its enormous downside. Then in the third chapter, I go into the rule of law, and what I try to do in each of these chapters is take a figure, a friend, or in the chapter on law, it's the dean of the law school at the University of Virginia, where I went and approached the 1960s through this person's eyes and my relationship to them. And I try to show in the third chapter how the rule of law was profoundly damaged. We can get into that later. And then in the fourth chapter, I talk about how we lost a sense of rootedness and how we lost our fundamental notion of home, that a nation has to have a sense of roots and a sense of home, and everybody and people in the country, ideally, should have a sense of home and a place where, whatever its faults, is a place that's us and where we belong. And I think we damage that. I think we damage that notion profoundly. And I'm worried about the damage that the 1960s did to national unity. It simply ripped the society open and created fissures which have thus far, which have yet to heal. And I wonder, really, if we come down to an existential crisis in America, whether we still have enough in common to pull together, or whether, beginning with the 60s and with many events since then, whether we are too splintered to face an existential crisis in a unified fashion. And finally, I talk about the damage done to religious faith and the way in which the pillars of religious faith and the role that religious faith, of whatever your faith is, the role that religious faith played in building a strong nation, and how that, in fact, was changed with the God is dead notions in the 1960s. So yeah. I think you can understand a lot about what we're struggling with today if you go back and look at this decade. But as I say, I had to do it in a very, very personal way. A memoir is nothing if you're not honest. Yeah. And I hope maybe that even people who disagree with me will say, you know, that the decade was not all peaches and cream.
Yeah. You know, throughout the book, you make clear that you recognize that you're seeing all these issues from your specific vantage point, your family background, your home environment, your education. But at the same time, I think by making that clear, you challenge all of your readers, especially those who live through the same times, to think about those events through their own perspectives. And so on the one hand, it's a very personalized memoir, but on the other hand, by doing it in such a readable way, I think you open it up to universals for the reader.
Well, I try to, Adam, and you know, one of the things when I was dealing with the editors, and they said, you know, you've had a very privileged background. You've had a lot of good breaks, and you know, how somebody who's really come up through a school of hard knocks, how's somebody going to identify with somebody like you? And so what I try to approach it is saying, oh, look, all of us in America have a limited background. All of us have a limited experience. No matter what that experience is, there probably is no one single American experience, whether it be mine or whether it be anybody else's. But the fact that we have different experiences, if that's going to keep us from coming together and listening to one another, then I think we're lost. But if we look upon our different experiences as a chance to explain, well, this is my experience, now tell me yours. It's sort of a gateway to listening, the fact that we have different experience. It shouldn't build up barriers where men don't understand women and whites don't understand African Americans and this ethnicity doesn't understand this ethnicity. Because if we go down that road, we are very, very fractured. And so I'm saying to the reader, this is my experience. I know in some ways it's different than yours, but hey, maybe we really have some important things in common too. Maybe we can talk and tell me about you. And one of the great things about writing a memoir is when I go around, I've spoken at a lot of different places, college campuses, senior centers, all kinds of different places, and people come up afterwards and say, you know, I really relate to that. Or they'll come up afterwards and say, no, I didn't relate to that. My experience was different. And I said, all right, I'll tell you what we do. Let's sit down a little bit. This is what the memoir was meant to be. You learn about me, I learn about you. And maybe, just maybe, we have a whole lot more in common than you might think. And so that's, I'm not naive, you can't universalize experience, but on the other hand, somebody's personal experience, everybody in this room has a personal experience, but that shouldn't act as a barrier to learning about others. And that's one of the things I really want to do with this book. It's a gateway, it's not a barrier.
The way you just put that reminds me of an anecdote in the book where you're playing tennis, right, in I can't remember if it's Richmond or Charlottesville, right after things start to get desegregated, and you're playing tennis next to an African-American couple playing, and you said at first there was, you know, everybody was obviously aware of this new situation. On the other hand, within minutes, everybody's chasing each other's tennis balls as they cross each other's courts, because that's what you do when you play tennis.
I thought it was cool.
Yeah, it was nice.
And I talk about it was, you know, you discover a personality, a commonality there, and so the public parks had been desegregated. Yeah. So we were playing next to an African-American couple, and sometimes their balls would cross on my court and I'd send them back. Sometimes mine would cross on their court and they'd send them back. And I said, hey, you know, this is cool. This is tennis. This is what we're doing. Yeah. Now, you know, with respect to tennis, that was a little bit of a sad tale in Richmond, Virginia, because I was a member of the Country Club of Virginia in Richmond, and that was sort of the premier tennis venue in Richmond. And I thought that because the Country Club of Virginia had these beautifully manicured and tended clay courts, the lines were swept, the courts were rolled, you know, it was just this lovely scenery. I thought, well, hey, these are the best tennis courts. There must be the best players playing on them. Well, guess what? I had a lot to learn, because while I was playing in my little enclave, all of a sudden I started reading about somebody or the name of Arthur Ashe. Right. And I'm starting to think this player has scaled the heights of national tennis, and he didn't play on our courts because, unfortunately, under the cruel system existing in that time, we didn't let him play on our courts. And I say this is so very wrong, and nobody ever thought about it. It's the silence of segregation that killed and wounded, because nobody ever brought the subject up about why Arthur Ashe or other African Americans couldn't play on their courts or be members of our club. And you know, all my life when I read about Arthur Ashe or watched him, it stung a little bit, and part of it was very selfish, because I really would get a big kick out of being able to come here and tell you, oh yeah, I hit some tennis balls with Arthur Ashe. We had some good rallies, the great Arthur Ashe and me. And you know how many balls I hit with Arthur Ashe? Not a one. And that's my deprivation. And you know, I tried to find out about Arthur Ashe and what kind of person he was. And the interesting thing was he's a very generous person. And if we had allowed him to become a member of our club and play, he would have helped me with my game. I wouldn't have had such a crummy backhand. I could have done a little bit better. So the question there is, when you see flaws in your boyhood and you see the silent cruelties of segregation, does that mean that you just sort of repudiate everything about your childhood? Is that the reaction when you see something is wrong as a segregated system? And what I try to say is, no, it doesn't really mean you turn your back on all that you were as a child or on how you grew up. And I witnessed so much in the South that was admirable, the neighborliness of it, the kindness of it, the sense of duty and patriotism and trust. And I wasn't going to repudiate my home. And the same thing goes, I think, with how we view the United States as a whole, not just our own region. Mm-hmm. We have, Lord knows, great flaws in our history. What our treatment of Native Americans, our history of slavery, the indefensible practice of segregation. But does that mean we repudiate the United States of America, or that we turn negative? Yeah. And the same thing with the South. Recognizing its flaws, do we turn negative? And I make the case, no, there's so much to love about America. And you know, you have to look at those Federalist Papers, and you have to just read the Star-Spangled Banner and think about the lyrics of it and how beautiful they are and how gorgeous the lyrics of America, the beautiful are, and what we have done to create this extraordinary contribution, and the Charter of Liberty and the Bill of Rights and the beautiful structural architecture of our Constitution, and the separation of powers, and the system of self-governance that we have made for ourselves, and the combination of capitalism, mildly regulated, plus democratic self-government, and the way in which that has helped to build an extraordinary middle class. So what bothers me is that when I went through college, and so much of what I hear today is so negative, and it is so wrong. And the 60s taught us negativism in class and out of class. And it's not an attitude we should be carrying through life. Because what happens if we turn on our boyhoods or childhoods because of admitted systemic flaws, or we turn on our country because of the sad and tragic aspects of our history, and we don't recognize the good, then we deprive ourselves of a sense of rootedness, we deprive ourselves of a sense of home, and we deprive ourselves of a sense of belonging, a place that, however flawed it might be, still has its virtues, and still it is you. And I worry about a nation where its people lack a sense of background and belonging and a sense of home, because we need that sense of home to make us feel part of a larger and more beautiful entity. So it's a way of dealing with our personal and national history. And the 60s taught us a mindset of negativism toward these things that I think has been, again, profoundly damaging to our sense of each other as a single, unified, and frankly, beautiful nation.
You know, a lot of folks are thinking about the 60s, especially today. When we scheduled this event, it didn't occur to me that it was going to be the 50th anniversary of Bobby Kennedy's assassination. That's today. And you talk a little bit about Bobby Kennedy in the book, and your changing understanding or recognition of him, up to, or, as he sort of came on the national scene in his own right. Now, of course, Kennedy himself went through the same sort of discovery and evolution that you described for yourself in recognizing the problems of the country, things that he hadn't thought about as much given his own background. And then when he came to recognize them and he wanted to make a difference, he didn't do it by condemning America, right? But rather by challenging America to be the best possible version of itself by drawing on its own virtues and its own history.
Well, I think you make a wonderful point, Adam, and that is that, I was really torn up about both Kennedy assassinations and the King assassination. They were just horrible, searing events. But you make such a good point, Adam, about that Robert Kennedy and John and also, but particularly Robert, because he lived actually in a much more tumultuous year. The early 60s was so different from the late 60s, and by 1968, things were really at a boil. Yeah. And it would have been so easy to have looked at the Vietnam War and just, turned angry at America and talked about imperialism and on all the rest. But Robert Kennedy never did. He was a big believer in this country and its potential, and that is why his assassination was such a shame. Yeah. And it happened toward the end. I was studying for my my final exam in law school, yeah. And we were going to have a contracts exam the next day. And I was studying somebody, came in and said, I still remember, it said, Robert Kennedy's been shot. I didn't believe it. I said, your television's lying. I'm going to turn on my TV and get the truth. Yeah. And that's how disbelief. And then I put down my books because I said, there's no way we can have this contracts exam tomorrow after what has happened. There's no way we can be thinking about the Uniform Commercial Code after Robert Kennedy's death. That would be obscene. And I got up the next morning, said the exam's still on. And I saw walking to school to take the exam, not having crammed, which I like to do. And I saw the dean of the law school walking there. And it was like, it was represented all the nobility of the law to me. And he was walking into the law school as if nothing had happened. And, you know, I couldn't understand. I said, here's this man that talks about the beauty of the law, about property law, state law protecting your property, and contract law protecting your expectations, and criminal law protecting your safety. And this man embodies the beauty of the law. And can't he see that the law in 1968 is crashing around his head? Yeah. And he's walking into the law school unperturbed. There wasn't a hair out of place. And, you know, I've tried to wrestle with that. What the dean is, how does this man manage to keep faith in the law when so much of the law, in so many different ways, we can go into it all, we're just crashing around him? Yeah. And so I've struggled with that ever since in the last few years, when there's so much damage being done to law. How does one keep faith? And how did the dean keep faith? And was it wrong of him to go in and say the exams will come forward as usual? Or was it right? Did he make the right choice? And so I've been struggling with the whole idea of when you see so much violence done to law, how do you keep faith in law? And I keep drawing on this man's and my personal relationship with him, which was not all that great because he was so remote and just reserved. But I keep wondering whether whether he just should have realized that this thing he idolized was just full of cracks and fractures, and it's a dilemma that I haven't ever been able to completely resolve.
You know, you said earlier that people need to keep in mind the difference between the early 60s and the late 60s. And that you explain in the book that your legal education sort of bridges that gap. You enter before things go crazy. And there's a line that really struck me. I wrote it down. You said, it didn't dawn at us at first at the law school that we were about to study law in one of the most lawless decades ever. That's striking, but then I thought about it, and that might be true, but the 60s were also maybe the most political decade ever. Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit about this later, especially in light of your other book, but what's this relationship between law and politics? That's not a shallow question, right? But in the 60s, where law is falling apart and politics is becoming inflamed, right? But it's the politics that ultimately gives rise to the law. How do you sort out that relationship in your head?
Well, I mean, it is true because what happened in the late 1960s, you go through it. We've talked about these assassinations, it was the 1960s marked this new chapter in assassinations, because prior to that, the tragedies had struck presidents, Lincoln and Garfield and McKinley and Lord knows JFK. Mm-hmm. And then the leap taken in the 1960s was that public prominence. Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King was enough to make one a target. An assassination is a tragedy whenever it occurs, but it was so broadened. And then you had these horrible offenses against law, students grabbing microphones in college and not listening to other people and shouting down speakers and occupying in administration buildings, which was so much the antithesis of what law was about, canceling classes. Well, that was an egregious offense against law. And then on the streets, you have Harlem and Watts and Detroit and Newark, just raging riots and the sad fate that's visited upon those shopkeepers in those inner cities and pedestrians and everything. And then one of the sadnesses about the wreckage of the rule of law in the 1960s was the way in which those entrusted with the enforcement of law went berserk. And you saw that early in the decade when Bull Connor unleashed hoses and police dogs on civil rights demonstrators. And you saw it later at the Chicago Democratic Convention when the police were running wild with their billy clubs. And then you saw it still later in Stonewall when the police raided the gay community in that tavern, and then the culmination of it all was those 4 students being shot at Kent State. And so law is just besieged in the 1960s from every direction. But that doesn't begin to answer the questions for me, because it was this odd duplicity or odd dualism to the decade, because law is besieged at a time when you would think law was working. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you had in the 1960s the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Mm-hmm. And you have the Warren Court and Brown v. Board of Education and its progeny, and Gideon versus Wainwright. And so what's so unusual about the decade, particularly in the first year, is a strong case can be made that the law was working from the perspective of many of the people who later defiled it. Yeah. And so the question I still wrestle with is, if there's going to be, how do we deal with this, what happened in the 1960s, which was this defilement of law and the absence of faith in law at a time when the legal system seems to be working and responding to many of the just grievances that are abroad in society. It was a combination that I'm still trying to figure out how those things, come together. Law got no credit for the good it accomplished. We don't want a country where that doesn't happen. Where people say, well, it's not. We can't do anything through the law. Well, we did in the 1960s.
Yeah, and you say at one point that the lawlessness that we saw in the streets and in society, it resulted from oppression. But that oppression was often under color of law, right? So you had this misuse of law, or this oppressive use of law causing lawlessness. And then later in the book, you sort of turn the relationship back around and you say, and then that lawlessness in the streets begat a lawlessness in our institutions. Yeah. All the way through, the story of the 60s doesn't really end until at least Watergate, right? Where you see the institutional breakdown of a respect for the rule of law.
Well, I think the thing that your question points out is that lawlessness is contagious. Yeah. And it's contagious, and this is the fundamental principle of lawlessness, is that an individual has a right to supplant the collective judgment of society at any time and for any reason, with a truth of his or her own, or a vision of one's own as to what is the higher good. And that notion, you can call it civil disobedience, but it's the whole idea of an individual judgment having a rightful claim to supplant a collective judgment. And of course, the viability of law depends on respect for collective judgments. Mm. And when an individual loses out in our collective process of democracy, you can live to win, not just to survive, but to win another day. But that doesn't. But you respect what the result is. But once you let the principle loose that an individual is not bound by collective judgments and can supplant them with one's vision of the own, that has no limiting principle, that has no stopping place. And these hideous acts of 9/11, I wouldn't draw any direct cause and effect relationship, but it sure did, I think, for many of us who had lived through the 1960s when those planes crashed into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, and or these terrorists march into this venue or that venue, and often they are claiming some higher good or some higher religious good or whatever that justifies violence simply because of the purity of their own vision. I saw the seeds of that planted in the civil disobedience of the 1960s. Now, many other things have come along to contribute it. And
Sure.
Cause and effect is never clean. But this is the notion that got going. And it's been profoundly damaging, and it's to say that modern day terrorists have not borrowed from the 1960s book is to be, I think, not, if not naive, a little bit blind.
On that breakdown of law and institutions, so much of your work reminds me of Alex Bickel, the late Yale law professor. And near the end of his life, he wrote what remains one of my favorite essays. It was in Commentary magazine, I think, and it was called Watergate and the Legal Order. And his argument in '74 was that the mindset inside of the Nixon White House was itself a reflection of too often the mindset in the Supreme Court of the 1960s, which seemed, willing to sidestep institutional self-restraint or forego it because it believed in what it was doing. It believed that its aims were genuinely just, and so much of what the court did was just. But in racing forward ahead of its own institutional role, it begat its own sort of loosening of respect for the rule of law. And of course, the Warren Court in turn was itself responding to or reacting to other institutional breakdowns that came before it. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I mean it does, because I really think that that the health of a republic depends upon a sense of institutional restraint, and you can have excess in the judicial branch. In my judgment, when judges fly off without without grounding their rulings in text or some legal materials that are different from some sort of political or policy justifications. And the executive can leap proper bounds if it doesn't respect the role of Congress or respect the role of courts. Mm-hmm. Administrative agencies can go wild if they start regulating in ways that bear no relationship to the organic statute. Yeah. The federal government can go wild when it doesn't respect the role of the states in our constitutional system. So all of these institutions, they all at any point in time have the ability to be governed by appetite, appetite by power, and they all have the ability to say to themselves, I do this because I can. Yeah. Not that necessarily that I do this because I should, I do this because I can. I say in the judiciary, we need to say, it's not how do I rule necessarily, but do I have the right to rule? You have to ask that. You have to ask that question. Do I have the right to do this before can I get away with this? And if I don't want to, the historical analogy is not terribly correct, but at a certain point in time, you begin to forsake the virtues of the Roman Republic, and supplant them with the excess and decadence of the Roman Empire. Yeah. Now, there are all sorts of problems with any kind of historical parallels, and that's mine is way overdrawn, but I still think that there's a little kernel of truth there when institutions act on appetite, and not with a sense of genuine modesty and restraint and respect for the other players in the system, and the fact that some bodies of government do better at some things than others, that maybe a state government can handle things a whole lot better than the federal government can, and maybe there are all kinds of institutional competencies and involved, and maybe even an administrative agency can handle something well if it has the expertise and it has the kind of authorization that's supplied by statute. But you're right that one of the real threats we face is simple this: institutional excess.
I want to talk a little bit about the courts and institutions, but one last, and then we'll get to audience questions. Everybody's waiting so patiently, but one last question about the 60s. There was one other line in All Falling Faiths that really jumped out at me. It was a pair of lines. At one point very early on in the book, you say, "Few decades did so much good for America as the 1960s." So much good for America.
Yeah.
And then the next sentence is, "But no decade inflicted so much continuing harm." But then a little bit later in the book, you just slightly rephrase this, and I'm very curious as to whether this was intentional or not. In the first instance, you said the 60s did good for America and did harm. And then the next time around, you connect them and you say, during the 60s, we could not accomplish great good without inflicting great harm. And I'm wondering, was the harm necessary to achieve the good? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, no, if I was a little more qualified, maybe it was the mellowing that come with age, because I wrote it at different points in my life.
Let me just interrupt. So much, as you said, so much of the lawlessness was the result of oppression, which was under the color of law. Mm-hmm. Institutions themselves were doing harm in many ways, and so many Americans thought that the only way, in the end, even in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act, the only way they could change what they saw was wrong was through lawlessness. I don't accept that.
And most answers that I give are qualified.
Yeah.
And I try to introduce a certain nuance to them. Yeah. But as I've just explained, the law was working. And the idea that violence or lawlessness is necessary to do this or that, it has no limiting principle whatsoever. And the thing is, we see things in different ways. What is one person's Valhalla and Nirvana is another person's Hades. Yeah. And law is what we have to mediate between terribly different perspectives, because we might have around this table 20 different views of a particular phenomenon. And if we each say, well, I'm entitled to take whatever steps I want to, if we buy off on this insidious notion that the end justifies the means, we're in trouble. Yeah. Because law is above all a commitment to means. It's a commitment of what our decision-making process ought to be. And, if I can be just categorical about something, I do not accept the notion that of violence and lawlessness is the answer to when somebody sees a particular defect in a social institution or whatever, because we all have our individual perspectives and we all see things that are wrong, but that is not a ticket to inflict violence on other people. And the thing about violence is it exacts an enormous social cost upon innocent people who are the victims of this, who've seen their businesses torn down, who've had their loved ones shot, who've had whatever. Just the path of lawlessness is a path strewn with damage and injury to people, to lawful people who wanted to live within the system, and they are victimized by somebody who said, no, no, I know better than everybody else, and I'm going to do whatever I need. I don't agree with that at all.
So let's talk about law. Let's talk about your other book briefly, Cosmic Constitutional Theory. This is another book where chapter by chapter you're picking a different, in this case, a different target, right? Living constitutionalism, what you call activism unleashed, and then originalism, which is activism masquerading as restraint, and then political process theory, which you call a third way down the rabbit hole, and then the fourth one is pragmatism of the style of Richard Posner. You say activism through anti-theory. And I remember this book when it came out. I reviewed it for one of the papers, and I'm reading through these chapters wondering, well, what's Judge Wilkinson's alternative going to be? And so then I get to that part of the book at the end, and you say what's needed is not yet another theory, but an escape from theorizing. And your argument was I don't have an alternative theory, I don't have a silver bullet, and the search for silver bullets is itself a symptom of a greater problem of how we see law. So now I reviewed your book at the time, and you didn't write a letter to the editor criticizing me then, but what's, if you could just explain a little bit more, what's your alternative?
Well, in Cosmic Constitutional Theory, the basic thesis is that we were sold a bill of goods. We have all of these, and these theorists are so terribly bright. I mean, William Brennan and Bob Bork and Dick Posner and John Hart Ely. I mean, they're probably some of the brightest minds in the country. And they each spun these refined and elaborate legal theories that's told, we're going to tell judges how they were supposed to resolve the cases and the rest and that. And I think we were sold a bill of goods. And I've come under a lot of criticism from both sides because I criticize living constitutionalism and originalism. And I thought that too often the theories operated as a fig leaf or operated as a cover for people doing what they wanted to do. And when you take cases like Roe v. Wade and Heller, one of the problems is that even though they parade these theories, the decisions often seem to break down along, if you'll pardon the expression, party lines. Yeah. And the comments have been made that the cases too often break down along the lines of what you'd see in a party convention or what you'd see in a political debate. And so I don't think you can take a document as complex as a Constitution and be reductionist about it to the extent of encapsulating it in a single theory. And I think there's no escaping the fact that a proper analysis of the judicial function is there has to be genuine self-restraint. We can't, we've been given life tenure, and we can't rely on the theories to do the job for us. We have to understand that by looking at, if we look honestly at the text of a statute or the history of a constitutional provision, or we look at the structure of the Constitution and the role that the other branches play and the role that the states play, and also approach law with a sense of modesty rather than a sense of hubris, I think we'll gain a greater respect. Because I feel that although we may cheer one decision or another from the sidelines, what I worry about, and I don't think public polling is the answer to all this, but the respect for the judiciary has gone down. The number of the percentage of Americans who feel that the judiciary has a transcendent role above politics has gone down, and that it concerns me greatly. And the only way I think we can recapture that is by recalling to mind some of the great jurists of the past, like John Marshall Harlan and maybe Oliver Wendell Holmes and Robert Jackson. They weren't perfect by any means. Hugo Black gave it a stab, but I really do think I think they tried to judge according to neutral principles that transcended results, and that marvelous article by Herbert Wechsler toward neutral principles of constitutional law sets out an ideal, and I just don't think that theory is gonna do the job for us. I have nothing but respect for Justice Scalia, and I would certainly try to follow the Supreme Court's decisions, no matter what my views might be. But it did concern me that the application of originalism in the Heller case, the Second Amendment case, went way across the ocean to consult the Stuart Kings, and went to 100 years past the enacting event to draw what seemed to me legislative history, to come up with a result that seemed to divide the justices along quote unquote liberal conservative lines. Yeah. And the same thing is right with Roe v. Wade. That when you read that Roe v. Wade decision, it doesn't read like a judicial opinion. Yeah. It reads like a statute. Right. You know, you have 1A, B, everything. You look at Roe v. Wade, and I said, my God, they're in the business of legislative draftsmanship. Yeah. And I said, there is something wrong here. And so in Cosmic, I try to go through, and I try to be fair, because I begin with the advantages of every theory and says, okay, these are the good that it's done. One of the good things that it's done, and originalism has done, is it's gotten us interested in history. Yeah. That's always a great thing. But then I say, okay, here's the harm it's done. And you tell me the harm in terms of public perception and in terms of unwarranted judicial activism seem to me, and Roe and Heller are two of the cases that I have reservations about, and they suffer from the same flaw, and that William Brennan was wrong. Yeah. I think Antonin Scalia was wrong. So I get.
Well, it was one thing, both when the book came out and before that, when you started criticizing Heller. It was one thing to see a judge, a Reagan appointee, criticizing Brennan and living constitutionalism. It was striking to see a critique of Scalia and originalism. And I remember at the time, you and Judge Posner both were criticizing it at about the same time. In fact, I did a piece with your friend who's here today, Terry Eastland, your successor at the Virginian Pilot.
There was no collusion,
right,
I promise you.
Right.
Dick and I do not collude.
Right. But so what's interesting is, you know, as I said earlier, you focus your last chapter on Posner, and you call his approach anti-theory as activism, or activism through anti-theory. Your alternative, I suppose, I would say, is restraint through anti-theory, right?
Yeah, you know, Dick Posner is a good friend of mine, and he's probably one of the brightest people that's landed on the planet. Yeah. But that you can be so bright that you have too much faith in your own intellectual capacities, and Dick's pragmatic theory was he was weighing the cost and benefits of this decision versus that decision.
Yeah.
And he was saying, well, here are the consequences of this decision or that decision. And, you know, I told him at the time, and I wrote it in the book, I said, Dick, you're not supposed to be doing that. Weighing cost and benefits and setting forth consequences and everything. That's for legislators. And look what you have done. You are forsaking the formal implements of law. You're forsaking the raw materials of law. Text, context, structure, history, and you're just sort of winging it. And I said, you have got to do something to get control of this. Yeah. And he didn't do any good.
Well, just one last question on this. You know, you call for judicial self-restraint, and it's something I think you're right. But when I think about this, I struggle because, you know, a great Virginian, James Madison, said that the key to our system was that we would have three branches, all three of them checking and balancing one another, and ambition of each branch would counteract the ambition of the others. Now, of course, later in the Federalist, Hamilton says, you know, the court is the least dangerous branch, right? But Hamilton was a New Yorker. What does he know? Let's focus on the Virginian. The Virginian said, and the ambition of each branch would counteract the others. So doesn't our system require and assume that the courts will be ambitious? Not self-restrained, but ambitious?
You know, there's a premise to your good question, and that is what has happened to the Madisonian model. He couldn't foresee the Civil War and the 14th Amendment, and he couldn't foresee the growth of the administrative state. And so what I wonder, Adam, is whether classic Madisonian theory says we all check one another.
Yeah.
But the modern practice seems several of the three branches, two of the three branches want to give power away.
Yeah.
You have the legislative branch, which wants to delegate everything to an administrative agency, and then you have a judicial branch, which under the Chevron doctrine wants to defer infinitely. So classic Madisonian theory is that we're all working to aggrandize power, and that aggrandizing power will check and balance out. But then you look at some of the behaviors of two of the three branches, and they're trying to devolve power and give it away. So the only answer I know is that each branch of government understand what its strengths are and understand what its weaknesses are. And when we look at administrative agencies, we have to do the same thing. We need to understand what an agency's strengths might be and all of the problems that go with the supremacy of the administrative state and how it's gotten out of control. But
you just wrote a piece on this for was it the Virginia Law Review?
It was a Journal of Law and Politics.
That's right.
And
That's very good.
Was talking about the administrative state and what its virtues were and what its drawbacks are, and you know, as comforting as it might sound to say, oh, every agency is bad, every agency is wrong, or agencies are the answer to all our problems. Yeah. It is a much closer and more difficult question than that.
Yeah, I was joking about New Yorkers and Virginians a second ago. This sounds crazy, but am I right? You were actually born in New York City? Is that right?
There's a Fifth Amendment in this room somewhere.
Like I say, you're the most Virginian New Yorker I've ever met.
Thank you. You've redeemed yourself.
Well, with that, everybody's been so patient. Why don't we open the floor to questions? Our only request is that there are microphones scattered, so please push the button to turn it on and speak into the microphone because we're recording it for the live stream and also so that we can hear you up here. don't we start here, sir? And if you could identify yourself.
Yes, my name is Charles Schott. I'm with the Center for Financial Stability in New York City, and I'm Stanford undergrad and biz school and law school at Michigan. And
could you lower that just a little bit?
Yeah. You can bring it to you also.
Okay. I first of all thank you for your presentation and for being here. I find myself, after listening to it, to be in a bit of a conundrum, and that is, on the one hand, I almost completely agree with everything you've said about the role of the judiciary and the role of self-restraint, but I find the 1960s to be the decade where that it applies to the least. And that's because of the one thing that you did not mention, which was the draft. And the draft was the elephant in the room for all of the 60s. It was something that applied very differently in the first part of the 60s to the second. I specifically remember the first time one of my friend's mothers surprised all of us by saying how that she opposed the war and the draft. This was like 1963, 64, because she could see it affecting her son. And you get to the late 60s in the colleges, and Lyndon Johnson has got hundreds of thousands of people going against their will to Vietnam. And I recall that Milton Friedman said that he felt his greatest accomplishment in his career was serving on the Nixon Commission that got rid of the draft ultimately. And the famous colloquy with Westmoreland in that commission, when Westmoreland said, I don't believe in an army of mercenaries, and Friedman responded, well, how do you feel about an army of slaves? And add to that the fact that the language of the 13th Amendment clearly contradicts the involuntary servitude. You have to go to the War Powers Act to balance something against the language that says involuntary servitude is not acceptable. So what I'm suggesting to you is that created the alienation. The people like, what's his name, Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky, are always with us. But the question is, what drives the average person to find that an acceptable way forward? In addition, just one last thing, is that you have the American tradition of our own revolution, which said, in Jeffersonian terms, another Virginian, that there comes a time when people have the right to rebel. And so that's where I find my conundrum today. In the 60s, I fully agree with you. I recommend a book that's a perennial bestseller in San Francisco called Season of the Witch. And it's the story of San Francisco from 1968 to 1983. The subtext is, one summer of love, 19 winters of discontent.
Before you answer, Judge, on the draft and on revolution, this is another anecdote that just jumped out at me at your book. You're talking about your spring of your third year of law school, and you say, at law school that spring, panic hit everywhere. The great Maginot Line of graduate deferments had crumbled. Suddenly we stood unshielded from the draft, the army, the war, about which we had read, against which we had spoken, from which we were supposedly secure. The draft so dominated conversation that to speak of something else became irrelevant. So what's your perspective now on the draft?
I appreciate the gentleman's question, because I lived through that, and I think the Vietnam War was a terrible mistake, and I indicated that at the time, and I indicated in the book, and there's certain very vivid memories that I call. One was the lottery. It was very different from Powerball. You had all these ping pong balls, and it was under the direction of Louis Hershey, who was the draft director and who was despised. And they would pull up your number on the ping pong ball, and that was what number. What was your number?
71, but I was in the year that it went below 71.
Okay.
But you'll be interested to know that machine that draws the numbers was finally bequeathed to the Federal Communications Commission, where it is used to do lotteries for
That's wonderful. Huh. Well, we all, you know, it's I think it's an emblem of how searing the Vietnam War was. We all remember our number on the ping pong ball.
That's why when President Clinton said he didn't remember his number, nobody believed him.
Nobody believed him. I mean, mine was 151. Yours was what, 71?
Yeah.
Okay, well, and you know, I remember trying to get into a reserve unit, and I would wait in line, you know, hours longer than for people wait in line for tickets to Duke Carolina football game. And and I remember, I mean, there were 58,220 mostly of my contemporaries who were killed. And you don't ever forget that. And one of the things that struck me so hard was the way these casualty figures were rounded off, sort of coldly rounded off. You know, this many thousand, we want this many thousand troops, we want this many thousand. And I had some good friends that were killed in that war, and none of us were pacifists. And if anything, the war has made me a believer in people like Eisenhower and Reagan, who try to gain peace through strength and foreclose war. But I'll tell you a little thing. I don't often ask much of audiences, but I do want to ask this of you. I was at Lawrenceville at the time, and I was on a soccer team with a fellow by the name of Dick Pershing. The name Pershing may mean something to you, but he was the grandson of John J. Pershing, who led the American Expeditionary Force in the closing years of World War I. He was very proud of that. And so we, you know, bonded over a soccer ball, the way guys can sometimes do. And we became close. And when the Vietnam War broke out, many of us who had higher education and everything were able to get into a reserve unit, and other folks who didn't have our advantages had to fight, and that was one of the real problems that's festering still. But when I talked to him, I said, Dick, why are you going over there? I said, what? He said, I've got to do this for my country and for my family honor and for my grandfather. And so he went and fought. We told him, you don't have to shoulder all this on you, put all this on your shoulders. Well, he died. He was the head of a search and destroy mission, and he was a second lieutenant. And he died within 4 months of being in Vietnam. And he died because he was retrieving the remains of a missing member of his unit, which, you know, is the old Marine and Army motto, leave no man behind. And Dick, as the company commander, was trying to retrieve these remains of his unit and send back to his family. And he got, killed by what the official telegram said was small arms fire. It tore me up. And so I'll just ask of you one thing, and that is when you go to Arlington National Cemetery in the mall, by all means, visit the wall, but then go into the cemetery and find the gravestone of John J. Pershing. Right there beside it will be Dick. He was buried right beside his grandfather. in honor. And I say, you know, Vietnam divided us so badly. And it still troubles me enormously that we refer the World War II generation, they are the greatest generation, but we should never neglect the service that these folks gave in Vietnam. Because like Dick, they didn't have to do so, many of them, but they went. And they should be honored, and we should not let the honor we pay our veterans rise or fall depending on the popularity of the war in which they fought. They rendered great service to this country. Now, I understand, because I lived through it, I opposed it, I didn't like what it did to my friends. But I think that the question I had to ask myself, did that justify lawlessness on my part? Did it justify pretending I had an ailment that I didn't have? Would it justify going to Canada? Would it justify some kind of, as I pursued a perfectly lawful course, I got into a reserve unit. I was never in Vietnam. I didn't have a single shot fired at me. I was never under fire. But I thought, well, you know, even as much as I oppose this war, it's not going to drive me to a lawless course. And I oppose the war deeply, but I did not approve of the fact that the war would let you set fire to this and that, or occupy this building or that, or shout down people who had a different view of the war. That was the final step I wouldn't take. And so I would say I come back, even in the event of a provocation like Vietnam, I would still think it's the greater the provocation, the greater our obligation to hold to the mores of law and to the process of law. The more we dislike something, the greater our obligation to work through the democratic process and the legal process to have what we dislike changed. And that was what didn't happen over Vietnam, despite the fact that the people who opposed that war, including myself, had very, very good reasons for doing so. And I think it's still that excess that I saw during those late 1960s years that probably motivates my sense of restraint on the bench, because I don't think what happened there was right.
Judge, you said that John Pershing said he was doing it for his country and for his family. Your dedication to in this book, in Fall Falling Faiths, is dedicated to my beautiful wife, who's here with us today, and to my beloved country. Now, we live at a time where there seems to be questioning about one's how family and kin and your commitments to family and kin, how they align with country, and our view of our relationships to one another, and our relationship to the country. How do you think about this, about family and country, and what do you think the country is missing right now?
I think it probably goes back to Alexis de Tocqueville, who talked about mediating institutions. You can't just have the individual and the country. You have to have all kinds of healthy mediating institutions in between. And the strength of the family unit is absolutely crucial. And the nourishment of religious faith is absolutely crucial. Church is crucial. Family is crucial. Community is crucial. Volunteerism, volunteer organizations are crucial to civic health. In a sense, local and state government are crucial. And I see the health of society as dependent to a very significant extent upon these mediating institutions, our schools, our churches, our families, and the rest. And I think de Tocqueville really put that in a good way. You just don't have a very healthy society if all you have is the smallest possible unit, an individual in the largest possible unit, country.
Yeah.
You have to have these mediating institutions, and we have to nourish the health of those. Law cannot go it alone. Our country in the abstract can't go it alone. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I wanted to write this memoir was to return to a very personal note. I feel that our generation, my generation in the 1960s, did so much to tear at this country. And one of the reasons I wrote the memoir is in the time remaining to us, before we leave this life in Shakespeare's stage for good, shouldn't we try to spend our remaining finite energies in some way, healing and bringing back together what we did so much, I think, to tear apart? And don't we have an obligation too, in looking back at the 1960s, to tell an upcoming generation, okay, here's my story, here's my personal story, and here are the mistakes I think we've made. Build upon what we did right, but don't, please, learn from us. Don't repeat the mistakes we've made. And then, also what, and this is a very small thing, but I really was very upset that I never got to learn much about my great-grandparents and my grandparents. And I finally learned that my grandmother had given birth to my mother when she was 45 years old in 1915. Well, that's amazing. I feel really lucky to be here. And my great-grandfather got rescued at the last minute from a stream with a very strong current. He was within an ace of dying. And a man named Harvie rescued him, and I got my name because my great-grandfather, and out of gratitude to this man who had pulled him from the stream, gave me his name, and that's how it went. So I thought, really, I'm lucky to be here. If there had been any little interruption in the long chain of cause and effect, I wouldn't be on this earth. And that probably goes for every person in this room. Yeah. If something different had happened to your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, yeah, we wouldn't be here. The chances of our being here are maybe, 1 in a billion compared to all the people that never arrived. And so if that's the case, I thought, well, why not do a memoir and express some gratitude for the people I've known and for the experiences I've had, and just give an ode of thanks to the utterly fortuitous circumstance that could have been interrupted at any time, that I've had the pleasure of being a citizen of this country and here on this earth, because the odds against us ever arriving and ever being here in this nice room together were so terribly long.
Yeah. Well, I was tempted to end on that note, but we have a little more time, and I saw their hands up. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, hi, my name is Mike Irocious, no current affiliation. Do you think that a lot of the problems that occurred in the 60s and early 70s are a result of the lack of trust in government? You have the Pentagon Papers, you have Watergate, that people started to distrust the government, and the government is making the laws, they're enforcing the laws, but then maybe the people felt that they were being deceived by the government.
Yeah, the answer to your question is I absolutely do. And one of the tragedies that hit during the 1960s is it wasn't just the rebellious students. The same way it wasn't just the rioters that went so far wrong. It was law enforcement as well, and it wasn't just the rebellious students. It was the badly mistaken government, and I still, to this day, do not feel that members of my generation were leveled with It was always victory was going to be right behind the corner, and General Westmoreland says, if we will just have another 20,000 troops that you'll send us, we'll turn the corner. And you know, the goalposts kept getting moved, and the horizons grew ever more distant. And what was left after Vietnam, and why it was so ill-advised, was not just a rift between classes, between the generally privileged who remained behind and the less privileged who, not always, but often fought. But there was that rift that was open in society. But there was also the rift between government and governed, with these constant stream of statements from LBJ and the Bundys and others that were badly misconceived. And so it opened up, the 1960s opened up in all different directions for all different reasons. All of these fissures in society, and those fractures have not healed. And you're absolutely right, sir, when you point to the absence of trust. And it argues for me, again, I just came to appreciate what kind of president Dwight Eisenhower was and what kind of president Ronald Reagan was, because they sought to build up American strength in all its forms, military perhaps above all, but also diplomatic and moral and economic and everything. And they were willing, they would have gone to war if the country had required it. But they didn't go. Reagan and Eisenhower, they knew that strength was the key to keeping us out of war. And they deserve, those two presidents, who are among my favorites, to my mind, deserve enormous credit for that. And I feel to this very day that, and I'm not alone, that I was not leveled with, that we were lied to in those years in Vietnam. And yes, that created a real drift, and it was compounded by Watergate. And you have got to be candid and straightforward with people when you're sending them halfway across the world to meet whatever their fate might be.
Judge, just one last thing. You and I spent so much time today and elsewhere talking about family. As you know, I have daughters. One turns 13 tomorrow. You have a daughter, a lawyer, and she has a fascinating job. She works for the Smithsonian, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What does she do?
She's the chief of staff to the Board of Regents at the Smithsonian.
Yeah. So many of the things you've talked about our national heritage, about respect for it, building institutions. The Smithsonian is one of the beautiful examples of this, right? One of the things that our federal government has done to build up cultural and historic appreciation of our country. What else do you think our government could do, our federal government could do, to help restore that side of our culture and restoring that faith and appreciation for this heritage that we've all been given by those who came before us?
Well, I think Adam, you bring up a good point. It's something all of us are struggling with these days, and I think that one of the things you have to do is set the right tone. You have to set the right atmosphere in which things can move forward. And setting the right atmosphere requires a degree of civility. And setting the right atmosphere means communicating to the good people of our country that every American matters. You know? The fact that you are of this religious faith, or the fact that you are of this political persuasion, or the fact that you are of this race or this ethnicity, the fact that you come from this region or that region, the fact that you're in a red state or a blue state, it doesn't matter. What matters is you matter. And we need to communicate that basic idea, because once we get across the idea that, yeah, we're in this together, it's not us against them, it's America and its great values to improve life in this country and to set an example for the world. But it begins with tone, and then it begins with a recognition of the problems. And I don't know the answers by any means, but what I do think I'll lay out in the book are some of the problems. And the other thing is it requires a commitment to process in resolving those problems. And the judicial process has some wonderful things about it, and we have to listen to arguments that we really disagree with right in front of us, and people have to listen to their adversaries. Well, you're putting them through torture in a way.
And on your court, they all shake hands afterwards, right?
Yeah, and we go by and shake hands to let people know there's nothing personal about the fact that they've just been grilled. But if you have a good tone that's set, if you have an embrace that's set, and you identify the kind of problems that I think the 1960s helped to bring about, but they weren't the sole cause. And if you have the right commitment to process, you can achieve an awful lot. Two people I want to recognize before we leave, if I may.
Of course, of course.
One is an old friend of mine, Terry Eastland of the Weekly Standard. We go way back, and he's a distinguished journalist and a distinguished commentator, and I always enjoy reading what he has to write. And another one I want to recognize is she's on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, Judge Karen Henderson, and she is really one of the truly finest judges in our country, and we are fortunate as a country to have the benefit of the services of someone like her. And then I want to recognize my wife, to whom I dedicated the book. I said to my beautiful wife, I still think, after 50 years of marriage, she is.
Well, we could put a microphone on her and ask her for equal time if she wants to respond.
She gets equal time. You don't have to worry. She gets equal time.
Well, Judge, I just want to say, if all of us imitated your civility and dignity and how you've carried yourself throughout your career, I think so many of the problems we face today would be more easily solved. But in the meantime, I'd say reading, especially these last two books, would be a good first start to fixing a lot of things. So thank you so much for writing these, and thank you so much for joining us today, and also thank you, all of you, for joining us today.
Well, I can't thank you so for having me here. As I say, Hoover has such a grand tradition, and it's one of those public policy think tanks that's giving real thought to tackling the problems of this country, and we are really lucky to have an institution of this caliber. And I want to tell you again, Adam, that you've got a great career ahead of you as a commentator on the toughest legal and social problems that we face.
I'm so glad this is being recorded. Well, I do want to say to that end, we have a couple of events coming up I just want to mention. On Friday, here again today, we're going to have an event with Shep Melnick, a professor from Boston College, who has a new book out from the Brookings Institution on Title IX and regulation of the Department of Education. So that'll be interesting. And then on the 26th, here again, we're going to have a half-day conference on the state of American liberalism in the classical sense, featuring not just another Harvie Mansfield from Harvard, but also another great Virginian, Jim Caesar.
Oh, yeah.
And so welcome you all to join us then. But in the meantime, let's thank our guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate your being here more than I can say.